Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Allah, welcome to the first of lectures in this series on Sira and Nabawiyya, the prophetic biography. It's great to see so many of you here. Many of you are old friends, but let me just, for the benefit of those for whom this is your first visit to the college, outline what it is exactly we do here. Cambridge Muslim College has been around for, I guess, 8-9 years of full operation now, so not entirely new. Essentially, we exist as a Muslim institution that seeks to draw on the expertise of the wider intellectual infrastructure available here in Cambridge, universities, libraries, scholarly expertise and resources and so forth, in order to see what happens when the classical Muslim narrative of scholarship and worldview interacts with and, inshallah, cross-pollinates with that other intellectual world. So we have researchers here who are at the cutting edge of some of the issues that Muslims often find taxing: science and religion issues, society and religion issues, legal issues. We try to address those not on an emotive or a sermonizing level, but at the highest level of rigorous contemporary scholarship, taking seriously the claims not only of our tradition, but of the dominant Western paradigm as well. We also have a diploma course in which we take a select few of the graduates of this country's Darul Ulum sector who have already mastered in that world the traditional Islamic sciences, but who want to see how those sciences apply to the real world which they're going to inhabit. The world of mosque congregations, the world of chaplaincy, of counselling, of media, of just existing in the unavoidable reality of a larger British society. And finally, and most recently, we have only 2 weeks ago launched our very exciting BA Honours degree in Islamic Studies, which is, I suspect, one of the best, if not the best, degrees in Islamic Studies available anywhere in the English-speaking world. We have a range of distinguished traditional scholars who are also trained in the best of the Western system of history, of intellectual appreciation, of contextualization of religious claims and narratives. And we've chosen, again, 12 very promising students who are going to be our first cohort, inshallah. And so, even though the building seems small, there is a lot of haraka and baraka going on within its walls. So we're grateful to you to add to that haraka and baraka for coming out this Saturday and listening to the blessed story of the Sira. Of course, Cambridge has a wider Islamic infrastructure. It's becoming a global Islamic hub. Some of you might have seen the media coverage on BBC TV yesterday of the new mosque which is being built in Cambridge Mill Road, and we've taken the liberty of distributing the newsletter of the mosque project and some of the products, the books, DVDs and so forth, which will be available for you to buy between my lecture and that of Sheikh Yahya, inshallah, in the college library, which is next door, are charitable products, so every penny you spend on those fine products will go to the Cambridge New Mosque Project or allied projects. So, to get down to business, and what a business it is the part of the divine artistry in creation that religion, which alone is what makes us truly human, because human beings live by that vertical dimension and are different from every other order of creation, that the phenomena of religion should be surrounded by a complexity of dazzling brilliance and beauty. One of the best ways of entering into the thought world of Islam is by considering the extraordinary epic, the saga, if you will, of the life of its founder. All of the world's religious founders, I suppose, have the world's best stories attached to them. The Gospels gives one version of one, the life of the Buddha gives another, and so on. These are humanity's truly great stories. So there's an aspect of literary and aesthetic greatness that necessarily encompasses the message, and you will not get to the essence of the religion in its deepest and most beautiful and most transcendent nature. You'll be left simply on the flat, on the surface, the description of things, unless you open your heart to the beauty of the story, to the majesty of the adventure which it recounts, as well as simply knowing what happened in what place and what particular date, the kind of boring, descriptive type of history which I'm going to largely avoid in the course of these few short lectures. So let's open ourselves to the possibility of a truly epic, Homeresque experience. This is a majestic story, and in it, as on the pages of Shakespeare, I suppose, or Homer, many of the great characters which exemplify the eternal traits of human beings are to walk upon that stage, to appear and to remind us that those characters exist as possibilities within our own souls. This is a timeless story, and it speaks to us directly. It is one of those great human stories which does not seem like a strange, quaint fossil from a different past, but in fact is a story that leaps from the pages at us and reminds us of the timelessness of the virtues and the values and the vices and the challenges which make us distinctively human. So it's a contemporary, not just an ancient story. But of course, in keeping with the ethos of CMC, we don't just want to tell a pretty tale. And everybody knows that much, perhaps most, of the historical information that we have, and which it is the historian's duty to sift through, is open to challenge, sometimes significant challenge. You can't begin a lecture on the past without putting on the historian's trusty suit of armour and saying, well, how do I know that this happened? A pretty story, si non è vero, è ben trovato, may not be the ideal principle for the historian. What actually happened? The Muslim memory, of course, out of love, enthusiasm, and energy, embroiders the story mightily as the centuries roll by. Look at Sira al-Halabiyya, or Al-Barzanji, or some of the later retellings and accounts of the tale, particularly of the prophetic birth. And you'll find that the information which is sketched out, often quite tentatively, by the earliest Muslim writers has been massively built upon, layered, embroidered, and it's our responsibility as scholars to respectfully set that aside and see what stratum of fact actually lies beneath. Now, what sources then do we have to rely upon in this great adventure of trying to discover what really happened? Well, the sources turn out to be copious, but sometimes very difficult for the historian to deal with. On the face of it, we have the world's largest pre-modern body of literature, the hadith literature, of which the Sira, the Maghazi, exist in effect as a kind of subset. Sira presents itself as a kind of hadith. But of course, as the Muslims themselves, to their infinite and undying credit, recognized from the earliest time, the historian has a duty to sift fact from fiction. One of the glories of Islamic civilization is that alone among the world's religious civilizations, it took the historian's duty seriously, and alone amongst religious narratives, we have the accompaniment of the mechanisms of isnad, of jarh and ta'dil, of narrator assessment, of often very detailed, argumentative, forensic, skeptical assessments of the veracity of reports. After all, the material that is being transmitted is of gigantic importance to how we live our lives. Hadiths about hijab, for instance, if they turn out not to be right or to be interpreted differently, the implications for Muslim societies will be gigantic. And so it goes on. But it is part of the greatness of our civilization, a civilization based on the search for truth and the setting aside of those emotions which all too often dominate religion nowadays, the inspirational, the sermonizing, the emotional, all of those things that get you all of those likes on YouTube, that the reality of Muslim scholarship is actually to set emotion aside and to use the brain, the mind, and the historian's best tools to figure out what actually happened. Because after all, what actually happened, if it is the life of the most beautiful human being and the most influential human being who ever walked the face of this earth, is going to be more interesting than any later fable. So what do we have? Well, we have a number of not only Muslim traditions of being skeptical And you note that even the earliest Sira writer, which is Ibn Ishaq, who dies in about 150 of the Hijrah, and is getting quite a bit of his information from the Tabi'een and the followers of the Tabi'een. So he's talking to people who had met the Sahaba, or talking to people who had met the Sahaba, when memories were really strong in a substantially pre-literate society, and where people were absolutely determined to preserve every last detail of the beautiful and inspirational and transformative life of the founder. Would have been very strange if they hadn't bothered. It's common sense that tells us that his memory was zealously conserved. So Ibn Ishaq has his great Sira, and I'll be basing these lectures primarily on the information that he narrates as the earliest of the Sira writers. And Ibn Hisham comes along a generation later and reworks Ibn Ishaq's material, adds some, but it's always possible to disinter the earlier stratum from the later, more concordist writings of Ibn Hisham. And then we have the great historian Al-Waqidi with his book Al-Maghazi, which is essentially a kind of political history of annals of the prophetic career. We have Ibn Sa'd, a little bit later, and a wealth of later writers, Tabari and so forth, who add a certain amount, transmit material that may not have found their way into the earliest materials. It turns out to be complex. And even Ibn Ishaq, and this is the greatness of our civilization, despite the manifest beauty and inspirational quality of much of what he transmits, very often says, and I don't have an isnad for this, it is said that, amongst the things that they allege is, and so you get the proper historian's sense of dubiety, of checking, of narrative investigation, of isnad checking and proof, and it is indeed inspirational. So we already work as Muslims with a tradition that doesn't just begin as a kind of fond myth that then is pieced together, like, say, Homer or the life of Buddha or the life of Zoroaster, but we begin with a civilization that really wants to know what happened and really doesn't want to follow that which didn't happen because of the momentous nature of a religion which was known to be the last religion. If this was lost, there wasn't another bus coming along. This was, as it were, the last bus home. We had to make sure that we had the material intact. Now we also have, of course, and in many ways, if we try to reconstruct and know for certain what is going on doctrinally in the Sira, we have the text of the Holy Quran. And the text of the Quran is indubitably an integral document of the prophetic age. A number of contemporary scholars, particularly in Germany, have tried to pick it apart, but in fact they haven't found significant alternative versions. They haven't found evidence of the accumulation of layers. They haven't found evidence of multiple authorship, all of those attempts, some of which are, should be said, ill-willed. There are kind of Catholic missionaries and the like operating amongst them. All of those attempts, it may safely be said, have fallen flat on their faces. The batil does not overcome the text. And very recently we have had the work of Behnam Sadiqi and others who have managed to find some of the most ancient fragments of the Quranic text and analyze them scientifically through radiocarbon dating. And indeed they have found with an overwhelming degree of probability that these do come from the earliest Islamic era. The Tübingen fragment, the one that you might have heard about a year or two ago that turned up, perhaps improbably, in a library in Birmingham. These are significant chunks of a text that is demonstrably what it presents itself as being. So we have the text of the Quran. The problem is, from the historian's point of view, the Quran is not always referential. That is to say, if you really want to know the details of the Battle of Badr, although it's alluded to in the Quran, you won't find it in the Quran. If you want to reconstruct the biography of the Holy Prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam, the Quran is not there for that. It's not like the Gospels, which just tell the story. Instead, it's about God's story, what God is doing in ancient times and in modern times and in times to come, but it's not a history book. It's not interested in that. So the Asbab al-Nuzul literature, an important genre of hadith, exists to try and locate the point in space and time where the light of the Quran breaks through the veil of infinity and enters this world, and that too becomes a hugely contested and difficult and often unresolved issue. So we have the text of the Quran, which maps out the doctrinal realities of the community and its sense of sacred history and the careers of those that went before. We also have some archaeological evidence. Unfortunately, there's never been any proper investigation of what's under the surface in the city of Mecca, which could be really important in terms of strengthening our sense of that narrative. It's just been swept aside in the profit-crazed desire to build ever higher skyscrapers and monuments. If you go down 9 stories to build an underground car park underneath your latest Las Vegas-style hotel, and you don't bring in the archaeologists, though you have to in most other cities in the world, then whatever evidence was down there that could support our narrative has been lost irretrievably. So that is unfortunate. But elsewhere in Arabia, we have archaeological work that has been done in South Arabia. And if you go down the road to the Fitzwilliam Museum here in Cambridge, underneath the main staircase, you can see that there's cases of South Arabian religious inscriptions and material. You can see some of the idols of the ancient Arabs and the little votive altars on which animals will be sacrificed to those deities, and inscriptions in Himyaritic. So what you dig up that is made of stone, that can be dated, that might have a date on it in particular places, is actually a very useful support to the historian's task. We have the excavations of a place called Qaryat al-Faw, which is in central Arabia, which has been led for years and years by Professor Abdurrahman al-Ansari, which turns out to be a major Arab, but in many ways Greco-Roman city, a kind of small version of Petra or Palmyra, indicating what many recent historians have tried to emphasize, which is that Arabia was actually quite integrated into the larger cultural and commercial patterns of the ancient world, because Qaryat al-Faw, even though it's a long way to the south of Riyadh, looks very much like a Roman city, the statues and the archways. It's part of the Greco-Roman ecumenical world. So Glenn Bowersock in particular, in his work on late Hellenism, and also his more recent work, The Throne of Adulis, where he talks about Arabia integrated into Red Sea trade that then led on through the Roman outposts on the Gulf of Suez to the rest of the Mediterranean, has really helped us to see Arabia as not a kind of outer space area, but linked into and integrated into the larger cultural patterns of the ancient world. So things like that are really useful. But at every point, as we chart this narrative, we will remember that particularly when you're dealing with very ancient times, and some of the stories which have historically encrusted the tafsir literature, usually for the best of reasons, about earlier prophets and the ancient history of Mecca, may be inspirational, but may not necessarily carry with them the full weight of truth. So much of what is in the Sira literature doesn't come equipped with isnads that are equivalent, say, to Bukhari's isnad. So the satanic verses story, for instance, which occasionally the media gets into a flap about, it's in Tabari, but it's nowhere attested with a fully reliable isnad of the type that Bukhari and Muslim will respect. So we're dealing with something that is interesting, but not necessarily in every case up to the highest standards of very meticulous and careful Muslim scholarship. The other point that historians, and Harald Motzki, who Josef Horowitz was the first Western scholar to write a book about the problem of the sources for reconstructing early Islam. Most recently there's been Professor Harald Motzki of Nijmegen University. What the better historians end up with is a sense that the story carries with it the fragrance of truth. They wouldn't use that word particularly, but there are so many elements in the Sira that nobody could possibly want to make up, that it does carry with it the sense, the commonsensical sense that it is indeed an accurate record. So, for instance, some of the most famous aspects of the Sira, Holy Prophet ﷺ marries a woman 15 years his senior. We know that. We think about it. They say that Khadija, she's 40, which was quite an age in Mecca in the 6th century. Who on earth is going to make up a story like that? If you're sitting in Syria 100 years later and sucking your pencil and concocting a whole story, you're not going to invent something like that. the Holy Prophet's death. Well, why isn't it a kind of majestic thing like the death or the departure from this world of Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam? He just falls ill with a fever. After 3 days, he dies. Nobody's going to make up something like that. So the very realism, the believability of the Sira counts amongst modern historians very strongly as an argument in favour of its authenticity. It just is not the kind of story that anybody would make up, and it carries with it a kind of commonsensical quotidian dimension. So we have this argument that will always continue. But we have the sound hadith and we have the Holy Quran, which are what is necessary for the construction of what we need to know about him, alayhi salatu wasalam. But let's move on now and consider another background issue, which is the landscape. Where is this happening? Well, here again, you can actually travel back in time and see what Arabia was like. Not in Mecca now, which really doesn't look like it used to, but just stroll out into the desert and you'll see how distinctive and stark and severe and astounding Arabia is. It's a huge area. It's like a subcontinent. It's bigger than India, bigger than Western Europe. It's a gigantic area, 1.5 million square miles, and trackless waste. Most of it is like the surface of Mars. You walk 10 miles north of Mecca and you wouldn't be surprised to see, say, the Mars rover kind of gliding over the horizon. It's kind of red and burnt and dead, and there isn't a blade of grass. It's very powerful. So here's one of my favourite quotes from Doughty. Do we know Doughty? The great English explorer 100 years ago, travelled around these places, lived with the Bedouin, and he has some really eloquent descriptions of what it's like. So here we are, Doughty's Travels in Arabia Deserta. All about us is an iron wilderness, a bare and black shining beach of heated volcanic stones. Few green stems of wormwood and southernwood springing on the sharp lava shelves give up a resinous sweetness under the withering broad sunshine. A vast bed and banks of rusty and basaltic bluish blocks, stubborn heavy matter as iron and sounding like bell metal, lying out eternally under the sand-driving desert wind, they are seen polished and shining in the sun. This titanic desolation, seeming in our eyes as if it could not bear life, is good Bedouin ground and heritage of the bold Muwahhid. Wholesome is that high attempered air, they have cattle enough, and those mountaineers are robust Bedouin bodies of rude understanding. It's a little bit purple perhaps, but you do get a sense of how inspired and amazed Doughty was. He never liked Islam very much. He had this kind of Protestant fundamentalist snootiness, but he was so affected by the Bedouin that when he came back to England, whatever it was, 130 years ago, for years he continued to wear his Bedouin clothes in Brighton or wherever it was that he lived, because he was just so profoundly moved by the place itself. So we also have a voice from that distant, pre-literate Arabian, almost Neanderthal, primeval wasteland, which is the famous Jahili poetry. We call it the Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance, kind of compound, double ignorance. Jahiliyyah, because they don't even recall what they have lost. But out of that sort of Neanderthal Mars, you get this amazing voice, which is one of the most beautiful poetic voices that's ever existed. It is astounding and moving, fatalistic, pagan, determined, heroic. Here it is. This is Duraid. Endure. For a man freeborn, only endurance is honour. Time is fell. There's neither help nor heal of the heart. Even it availed a man to obey his fear, or a man could parry trouble by any low consent, still to endure the full brunt, cut and thrust of fate with a manly front, to endure's the only honour. There have been a number of interesting translations of the Jahili poetry, despite the endless arguments about how accurate and reliable and authentic it is, because they didn't write. It was only transmitted orally. Such fragments as were written have long since vanished. One of my favourites is by somebody called Omar Pound, who is actually the son by Dorothy Shakespeare, who is a well-known cultural figure at the beginning of the 20th century. Ezra Pound had this son whom he called Omar Pound, who actually, after he did an Arabic degree in SOAS, ended up here in Cambridge. In the 70s, he was teaching at what was then the Cambridgeshire College of Arts and Technology. And he was an Arabist and a Persianist and a poet in his own right. So he produces a volume of translations of Arabic and Persian poetry in which he tries to bring it up to date a little bit to make us understand it. And there's something about this kind of fatalism, the sense of human honour, of the meaninglessness of existence that actually appeals to a certain type of 20th century austere atheistic outlook. So here he is with the Mu'allaqa of Abid ibn al-Abras, who dies in about 550. This is Omar Pound. No head ropes or dung, the chandlers, bakers and Whitbys all gone, with death their only heirs. Slaughtered and scattered, shame on greybeards left behind. My eyes seep sorrow, water skins with holes, as I recall my first horse and foal and that slip of a thing next door. How can I stay and overlook a land where water hurried and sandgrass scurried, topsoil and all my people gone? None to inherit herds, spoils despoiled, where even quick ones fail and weaklings sometimes win. Men cannot save those who cannot learn from time. Help the land on which you live, where only judgment aids a man. Don't groan and sigh. I am a stranger to this life, for strangers sometimes bring more than a kinsman turned strange can. The hunger we live, the more we deceive ourselves and mourn long life, long trouble. What's left is rubble. Pray to the gods, but never beg of man. You get a good kind of aroma of that pagan sensibility, which you find again in the better pages of Homer, Plutarch, and some of the ancient authors. The idea that the next world, if it exists, is probably a dark and dreary and shadowy space, never to be looked forward to. There is no ultimate meaning to morality and no ultimate restitution for wrongs. All that we can aspire to is what the Greeks used to call greatness of soul, one of Aristotle's virtues. In other words, manly virtue, virtus, be a kind of hero. And the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons and ancient pagan peoples, and no doubt those who built Stonehenge, that rather terrifying place, subscribed to the same kind of outlook. This is a classic form of paganism with its emphasis on the male and female virtues, with its emphasis on warriorhood, its emphasis on the tragic greatness of man. But it's a rather dark image. And it's interesting to reflect on this given the current vogue for paganism now in Western cultures. You go to Stonehenge now on the summer solstice, and there's all of these kind of Green Party types and grey-bearded hippies sort of waiting for the sun to come up, and they think that somehow what they're doing is harking back to an ancient time when things were much better, when we hugged trees and spoke to animals, and we were all vegetarians, and we were all feminists, and it wasn't really like that. If you read the Jahili poetry, and you read, for instance, what Scotland was like before becoming Christian, or what paganism really was like, it's a fairly frightening and occult sensibility. Look at those old Arab gods in the Fitzwilliam Museum, and they're not there to reassure you with their big eyes and their stern features like African images of gods very often. They're there to frighten you, to say, if you don't serve me, something terrible is going to happen. It probably involves witchcraft. This was the culture of the Arabs before Islam. And the only people left, really, who were like that in a world which all around them had traded up to monotheisms of various kinds. It's interesting to reflect. Christianity is born in Palestine, which is a Jewish monotheistic island, surrounded by thousands of miles of paganism. Islam is born in a world which has become monotheistic, except Arabia and the Meccan pagan heart of Arabia, which still continues the old pantheon of the ancient world and a form of life that had been there since time immemorial. And that is part of the measure of the greatness of the man. We might make that point. Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam is working to promote a form of monotheism amongst people who are monotheistic, and he doesn't really preach to those Roman centurions and others who are around. They just kind of walk on and off. But the Holy Prophet alayhi salatu salam, as a muwahhid, really is a prophet crying in the wilderness because his entire people are قَوْمٌ مَا أُنذِرَ آبَاؤُهُمْ فَهُمْ غَافِلُونَ. That's a much greater task. And the success of his mission in those 23 busy years is a measure of the greatness of the man, as well as of the susceptibility of the human heart to radical paradigm shifts. In any case, we have that sort of shatteringly hot, blasted landscape, and we have these people with this rather dark, occult polytheism. And then we have the story, which they know, but which they don't know what to do with, of there having been an alternative way of being Arab, which is not Christian and not Jewish, even though there are communities of Christians and Jews in various parts of Arabia. But another kind of monotheism that is in some obscure but not nationalistic sense their own, and which is to do with the heart of their religious culture, which is Mecca itself. So Mecca, the heart of paganism, and the fairs bring people in, and the holy months are focused on the Hajj, but it's pagan. But there's still a recollection of there having been something else there once. It's a very kind of odd idea for a sacred city. This is what we do now, but at the back of our minds we know that it wasn't quite supposed to be this. In the Kaaba, according to the historians, there's a picture of Ibrahim alayhi salam, and he's holding in his hand the divining arrows, the Aslam, with which the Arab sort of wizards and soothsayers would tell the future. Very strange mixture of pure monotheism as a recollection and the reality of a pure paganism as people's actual practice. And this kind of dual narrative in Mecca defines it and makes it really quite an unusual place in the ancient world. Jerusalem, for instance, has never had anything like that. So then we get the great story of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam travelling south with his wife, slave girl, Hajar. And that again, which is kind of the founding of Islam in a certain sense, is freighted with all kinds of significance. So the promise evidently should go to the firstborn. Ismail is the firstborn, but he is by Hajar, who is the slave girl, and she is not Hebrew, she is Egyptian. And to the authors of the book of Genesis, that means she's really from outer space, she's impure, Gentile, can't possibly be part of God's story with chosenness. Egypt in the Bible is always figured as the Gentile other. It's the place where paganism happens, where all the bad stuff happens. She comes from Egypt. Abraham has his firstborn by her. That's one of the kind of brilliant ironies. The book of Genesis, a very brilliant, profound piece of writing. And then, of course, Sarah, in her old age, produces Ishaq. The name means he laughed. Ismail, God heard. Ishaq, he laughed. And Ismail and his mother are cast out into the wilderness. And the book of Genesis at that point leaves them. There's the mention of the well, and there's the mention of a vision given to Hajar, but the Bible's narrative is constructed by men who are concerned with the Israelite story. That's what the Bible is. So they wander off and don't really reappear, although the Ishmaelites occur sometimes in biblical history later on as kind of bad guys, bandits, pirates, and the like. But it is the irony and the brilliance of divine wisdom, which would be very reassuring for anybody who lives in dark times and doesn't see any light at the end of the tunnel, that even in the times of greatest weakness and darkness and vulnerability, astounding new beginnings can come. So you all know the story of how they were in the desert, and to be banished, for a woman to be banished alone without tribal support or networks in the desert with a child is a death sentence. It's just like being asked to cut your son's throat. It's another binding, as it were. It happens to Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam. And it's such a monumental and beautiful scene, and emblematic of a certain possibility in human life, which is the vulnerable woman, the asylum seeker, the foreigner, the single mother out in the desert, abandoned by a patriarch. Modern feminists love this story, and they often beat up on Abraham a lot as a kind of symbol of male cruelty. And there is Hajar, ethnically impure, rejected, repudiated, out with her son, but still being strong. She's perhaps, of all of the Bible's female figures, the one whom the feminists like most. If you look at Phyllis Tribal's book, Texts of Terror, you'll see they don't really like the Virgin Mary, they don't like Ruth, they don't like Miriam, but they really like Hajar, interestingly, although, of course, her Islamic connection is something that they don't wish to think about. In any case, that is kind of our prehistory, our original foundation, because it is through that that Zamzam comes about, and it is through that that the Sa'i comes about, and it is through that that Ibrahim, when he comes back, raises up the Kaaba and the Maqam Ibrahim, and it's all the Hajj, which is the ibadah of the lifetime, is about remembering that really obscure story of the girl in the desert with her baby, and this is part of the greatness of religion. Who goes with love to the great pyramid of Giza nowadays? It's kind of scary when you look at it. But who doesn't go with love to the Sa'i, Safa and Marwa, remembering the faithfulness of that solitary woman with her child? She wasn't going to give up. She was going to look, even though it seemed hopeless. It's a very moving story. So here is Tabari's account. Ismail grew very thirsty. His mother looked for water for him, but found none. She listened for sounds to help her find water. She heard a sound at a Safa and went there to look around, but found nothing. Then she heard a sound from the direction of Marwa and found nothing. You have to remember, this is the desert, really silent. It's one of the only places on earth where you really hear silence, and it's quite sobering, transcendent in a certain way, very prayerful. Here's a sound, Marwa, finds nothing. Some also say that she stood on a Safa praying to Allah for water for Ismail and then went to Marwa to do the same. Then she heard the sound of animals in the valley where she had left Ismail. She ran to him and found him scooping water from a spring which had burst forth from beneath his hand and drinking from it. Ismail's mother came to it and made it into a marsh. She kind of squished it. And she drew water from it into her water skin to keep it for Ismail. Had she not done that, the waters of Zamzam would have gone on flowing across the surface forever. So we have this sort of the emblem of weakness. What is more weak in the ancient world, or even nowadays, than to be outside your own country, to be female, to be effectively a single mother, to have a child who's dying of thirst? All of the symbols of weakness. She's an asylum seeker, she's a refugee, the kind of lowest of the low everywhere are in her, and yet Allah brings about the symbolic wellspring of Islam from that moment of weakness. And the sa'i between Safa and Marwa is probably the only ritual in any of the world's religions which is explicitly known to be founded by a woman. So we are Hajarines very much, and we are proud of that. And of course, one of the things we recollect when we do the Hajj and the Umrah, inshallah, is that she is buried there. Azraqi and all the Meccan historians say that she's buried in the Hajar with Ismail, which is why it's called the Hajar Ismail. Tell some of the Saudis that when they make tawaf, they're actually going around two graves at the same time, and they kind of get into a state. But that's all the historians agree, that is the reality. She's buried there. May Allah be pleased with her. So we begin, or Islam begins, with this memory of a monotheistic difference in Arabia that comes out of weakness and comes out of maternal fidelity, one of the most beautiful emotions known to man. So, Ali Shariati, one of the sort of kickstarters of the Iranian Revolution, wrote an interesting book about the Hajj from a kind of crypto third worldist socialistic perspective, in which he reflects, as he does the Hajj, on the meaning of the rituals. So he says about Hajar, from among all humanity, a woman, from among all women, a slave, and from among all slaves, a black maid. In other words, Islam is to be for the mustad'afin, for the weak, for the third world, for the oppressed. It's not for the owners of the mega banks and the mega corporations of today. It is always with the weak, and that's what the Hajj signifies. Then we have Ibrahim alayhi salam coming and settling his son by the Kaaba. So Tabari again says this. God commanded Abraham to settle his son by the Kaaba, wishing thereby to show a mark of esteem to one whom he later ennobled by means of his Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Ibrahim, the friend of the compassionate Khalilur Rahman, and his son Ismail were custodians of the Kaaba. Mecca was then uninhabited, and the surrounding country was then inhabited by the Jurhum, the Arabian tribe, and by the Amalekites. The Amalekites, a bit like the Ishmaelites, do come up occasionally in the Bible, and again they're kind of emblematic of Israel's nemesis, Israel's other. They're mentioned in the book of Exodus, the book of Samuel. The Israelites defeat the Amalekites in the book of Samuel, although they're not wiped out. So it does connect with the biblical narrative here. We know that after the Kaaba is raised up as أول بيت وضع للناس, that there is a decline as the Bani Ismail, the custodians of the very remote place in the desert, just this roofless cube in the middle of Wadin Ghayri Dhi Zar', a valley without cultivation, surrounded by these pagan tribes. They are replaced by Jurhum, one of whose women is married by Ismail. This is Sayyida bint Mudad, and according to the historian, she bears him 12 sons. That's the kind of detail that we're not formally committed to, but it's there in Tabari and some of the Sira writers. 12 is a good number. So Jurhum then managed to take over, and Jurhum are from a different kind of Arabian stock. They're from further south. They're from the original Arabs, not the Arabized Arabs, who are people who come down from Syria and the north, but the original Arabs are those who come from the south and Yemen. And even today, where Arabs are aware of their tribal affiliations, they'll probably be able to tell you whether they're from the original Arabs or Arabized Arabs. The Quraysh are from the Arabized Arabs, the descendants of Ismail, therefore ultimately from elsewhere. And this is again one of the things that Mecca represents. This is kind of the midpoint in terms of latitude in Mecca. So you have the influences coming from the north, tribes from Syria and northern Arabia, Tabuk, places like that, and then the tribes moving up from the south. And generally the preponderant movement in Arabia for centuries was moving up from the south into Syria. So even in Syria today, you have tribes like the Bani Ghassan, who are originally Yemeni, but moved up centuries before the origins of Islam. And many of the Arab tribes that settled in Spain finally were of Yemenite stock. So this original dispute between the Bani Ismail and the tribe of Jurhum represent a principle that's often happening in Arabia between these two different types of Arabs. And then Jurhum are thrown out by the tribe of Khuza'a. Again, this is in very ancient times. It's very difficult to even guess at the dates. We know that Khuza'a are another Yemeni tribe who have settled in Tihama, which is the coastal area of Hijaz, and then move inland and manage to expel Jurhum. Of course, Mecca, even though it seems to be in the middle of nowhere, is actually strategically useful and has this amazing well, a well that never runs dry, which is very precious in Arabia. Ibn Ishaq says that the reason for this was that the Jurhum had abused the sanctuary, had maltreated pilgrims who wanted to go there to enjoy its holiness, taxed them, stole its gifts, and so forth. And therefore, as it were, the city did not tolerate the presence of Jurhum. And that's one of the explanations for the name, the ancient name of the city, Bakka, because Bakka is said to be from the word yabuku, which means to break, because it used to break tyrants. Because of its sanctity, it could not endure tyranny to be practiced there for long. So after maybe 3 centuries, the historians say Jurhum vanish, but before they leave, it's kind of at the very last moment, it's like the Americans pulling out of Saigon or something, it's in a hurry. They want to deprive Khuza'a and others of the well. So the last king, Amr of Jurhum, fills in the well and buries the great treasure of the Kaaba, which is 2 golden gazelles, in the well, and levels it so they've gone. When Khuza'a come, they simply won't know where the well has been, and indeed it remains unknown for centuries. Incidentally, it's not the only well in Mecca. If you read a book about the city, you'll find that there's at least 30 wells which have names, and many of them have special qualities, khasa'is, which are named in the Sira. But Zamzam is, of course, the great well of Mecca, and very distinctive. I once worked with a Swedish geological firm back in the 80s who were doing a hydrographical survey of Western Arabia. And these Swedes, not Muslims, were really amazed by Mecca and by Zamzam because it exists at the confluence of two completely different watersheds. So if rain falls 100 miles away in one direction, it ends up in Zamzam. If it falls 100 miles away in another direction, it meets in Zamzam in a kind of underground waterfall, which they took photographs of deep underground. They said it really was geologically quite a unique thing. So Zamzam is kind of special, but it disappears. It's buried. Jurhum push off, and the city then becomes pretty insignificant. And then we have the story of how monotheism declines and paganism prevails. So the king of Khuza'ah becomes sick. This is Amr ibn Luhay, and then Tabari tells us this. He was told, there's a hot spring in Balqa in Syria. If you go there, you will be healed. So he travels to that source, bathes in it, and is cured. While he's in that place in Syria, he notices that the people in that neighborhood were worshipping idols. He asked them, what are those things? And they replied, oh, we pray to them for rain and for victory over our enemies. So he said, can you give me some, please? And they do so. And he takes them back with him to Mecca, and he sets them up around the Kaaba. And this very soon becomes something that meshes with the more ancient worship of the Arabs, particularly the worship of Ansab, which is kind of sacred rocks which are propped up rather like the menhirs and the dolmens in the Celtic world. And the Arabs were, according to Roman historians and others, really very fanatical in their worship of these images. So here's Ibn al-Kalbi, who writes a very interesting book, Kitab al-Asnam, which is a book in which he interviews people who remember what their grandfathers knew of the ancient paganism. And it's a very interesting collection of what they would recite to their idols, what the idols look like, the particular tribes associated with particular idols. It's a really interesting book. So this is what Ibn al-Kalbi says. The Arabs were fanatical in their idol worship. Some had a temple in which they worshipped. Others bought their own idol, which they then adored. Anyone who could do neither would put up a stone in front of the Kaaba or in front of any other temple and then make tawaf around it. The Arabs called these stones ansab, but when they looked like a living form, they called them asnam, idols and fetishes. And this again represents a decay of something that had some primordial significance, because very many ancient sanctuaries, including Solomon's sanctuary in Jerusalem, were built over a stone. The foundation stone of the Holy of Holies was something which in that prophetic age represented the holiest point on earth. The Ark of the Covenant actually rested upon it. But this was then paganized in the superstitious belief that there was something in the stone that could do your bidding, or you could haggle with if you made enough sacrifices to it, poured blood over it, and so forth, and became a very crude and occult phenomenon. And of course, the black stone then, which was never used for those purposes, is simply the point at which we begin the tawaf. So it's the stone, not in itself, but as Allah's right hand on earth, that negates the false worship of stones and points us in the direction of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's where we begin, not where we end. Matter points to the immaterial. Matter in itself is just matter. So it's totally different. So we know that the different tribes served different gods. Ibn al-Kalbi tells us this in some detail. But polytheism itself has always been a kind of diverse thing. And the ancient Romans and Greeks, who were kind of cultivated people, recognized something that Tacitus calls the interpretatio Romana. In other words, when the Romans went to a new province, They came to Britain and they found the British worshipping idols of various kinds. Or Caesar conquers Gaul, and we've got his diary that he wrote during the conquest of Gaul. And he points out he's not really religiously fanatical against the people of those countries. He says they worship our gods, they just give them different names. So the Roman Empire tended to be religiously quite kind of ecumenical civic society. You just left each other's gods alone. But in the context of Arabia, it was very much the case that individual gods were identified with particular tribes, which was why before Islam, Arabia was constantly unstable and at war. One of the great virtues, ethically, of monotheism is that it transcends tribe, race, everything, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala transcends that. But a humanized deity can't transcend gender, time, space, and so forth, and necessarily is a divisive principle. Again, a lot of feminists don't like Christianity because God becomes male flesh, thereby excluding females. In the context of proper Semitic monotheism, you don't have any problems like that. So, Hubal is the great deity of Mecca and exists in a kind of pit or well that's dug inside the Kaaba, and all the treasures and the gold and so forth that's donated to Hubal pile up in this trench. And Hubal's principal activity is the casting of auguries through sacred arrows, usually 7 arrows, and there would be a kind of high priest or a geomancer or a wizard who would preside over the process of telling the future, or who should I marry, or whatever it was, which arrow came out. It's rather like the drawing of lots, and this was the main activity. And you'll see something similar if you go to some Taoist temples in China today. Much of what the priests do is actually kind of fortune-telling through drawing lots, the I Ching used as a means of augury. So Khuza'a are firmly in charge, but eventually they allow the Bani Ismail to kind of trickle back. They bring a lot of prestige because the Arabs do revere Abraham, and they know that the Ishmaelites have that distinguished ancestry, which means a lot to the Arabs. So they return, and they return in the name of Quraysh, a branch of Bani Kinana, maybe, according to our historians, some 7 or 8 centuries after Abraham and Ishmael build the house. But the key figure, who does seem to be a real historical figure, was somebody called Qusay ibn Kilab. Qusay, the ancestor of Quraysh as we know them today. You can't really claim Qurayshite ancestry if you go through some other branch and you're not from Qusay. This is probably around the 4th, maybe the 3rd or the 4th century of the Western era. So maybe round about 300, 400 AD. That's probably a pretty accurate guess. And we know that the Quraysh had always had the strong desire to return to Mecca. They had the memory of Abraham, even though they've paganized. They know that Ismail and Hajar are buried there. It's kind of their watan. They want to go back. It's their ancestral land. Now, so Qusay, who is really very smart, strong, handsome warrior, a leader, asks his mother how he could retake Mecca from Khuza'a and the other tribes. She says, well, why don't you go there first on the Hajj pilgrimage in a sacred month, and then you'll be safe. And as a strong, good-looking guy, he managed to have accepted his proposal in marriage to a girl called Hubba, who is the daughter of the ruler of the city of Mecca. That's Hulayl of Khuza'a. So he settles back in Mecca again. Bani Ismail are back. And by Hubba, he has 4 sons whose names are all significant: Abdal, Abd Manaf, Abdul Uzza, and Abd. Okay, they ran out of names, I guess. They're just Abd. The registry office just called him Abd. And he also becomes wealthy. This is a real sort of entrepreneurial guy. He comes from the deep desert, from a tribe that's kind of problematic, but he marries the chief's daughter, makes a lot of money, and establishes himself. And then his father, Hulayl, dies, and Qusay says, now is our chance. We, the exiles, can take over again in the holy city. So he plans a revolution. But how does he do this? Well, you have to remember or imagine what Mecca was like then. It wasn't the abraj and the hotel and the clock and the lasers. It's kind of one of the poorest, simplest, smallest villages you can imagine. Even in the time of the Holy Prophet, ﷺ, only the Kaaba is built of stone. Everything else is just a kind of clay, adobe. Very simple, and people aren't living on the valley floor, which is subject to floods, but up on the hills. Different tribes and branches of tribes each have their own hill, and often there's tumult between them. But there isn't really a government, but because there's the pilgrimage, there are various offices or privileges that different people compete for. Who is going to be in charge of watering the pilgrims? Who's going to be in charge of feeding them? That's the rifada. Who gets to hold the key of the Kaaba? Who gets to keep all the taxes? And one of these offices is called, it's rather obscure, the Sofa. And these are people whose only function really is to tell people when they can do the stoning of the pillars at Mina. So they have to start it. When the sun goes down, nobody's Hajj is valid unless these Sofa guys have thrown their stones. وَرَجُلٌ مِّن صُوفَ يَرْمِي لِلنَّاسِ لَا يَرْمُونَ حَتَّى يَرْمِي. So this was what they did. And so Qusay and his followers of Quraysh kind of think this is the point at which we can start to infiltrate the significant positions in Mecca. So they go to Al-Aqaba, which is where the Jamarat are, and they said, we have more right to this than you. Who are you guys? And there's a kind of fist fight, and these Sofa guys just leave. That's one account. There's another account, which is that Hulayl, who seems to have been very fond of his daughter, bequeaths to her, as he's getting older, during his lifetime, the right to open and close the gates of the doors of the Kaaba. He must have been in his dotage, because the gates of the Kaaba weigh like a ton, so to give your daughter that duty is kind of... So she can't do this, and a man called Abu Ghubshan, according to the historians, is deputed to help her. And so Qusay goes to this Abu Ghubshan, who's chosen just because he's kind of tough, and buys the right to open and close the Kaaba for a skinful of wine. Okay. So this is how Qusay is getting into the corridors of power in the city of Mecca. And whatever one makes of these accounts, he does become effectively the king of Mecca. And all of the big offices, the keys of the Kaaba, watering the pilgrims, control of Zamzam, devolve upon him. So he brings Quraysh into the city. And because there's other tribes on the hills, for the first time he's settling people on the Batha, which is the valley floor, the flat area between the hills, and he cuts down the trees, presumably just a few acacias, probably. It wasn't a forest. Wadin ghayri dhi zara, a valley without cultivation. You can't grow crops there. And that becomes the beginning of the town of Mecca. And another thing he does is to establish a kind of meeting house, which is called Dar al-Nadwa, which is only for Quraysh. If you're from another tribe, you don't get to enter this kind of government building and vote. You have to be at least 40 to enter it and vote, and it has a door opening right onto the Kaaba. And so it becomes kind of a political city for the first time, rather than just a well that tribes visit. But again, remember, this is kind of a small village. There isn't really anything like the mosque today with walls around it and gates that you go in, and there's the haram and a million Yemenis reading Quran, and it's not like that. It's just the Kaaba, which doesn't even have a roof at this time, and a few houses around it, so there's a kind of square, and people go there because it's the bazaar of Mecca to buy and sell, and the idols are set up around the shrine as well. So Qusay achieves this coup, but then he gets old, and he has these 4 sons, remember, Abdal, Abd, Abd, and so forth. Abdal is the oldest, but the second son, Abd Manaf, is the most capable and really popular. And Qusay wants to raise him up, so he gives him the key offices of feeding the pilgrims, watering them, gets the keys to the Kaaba, gets the Dar al-Nadwa, and these tasks eventually become combined into one. Which still goes to this day, because the Holy Prophet, when he conquered Mecca and the Fath Mecca, gave all of these historic honours and privileges to the Bani Shayba, who hold it to this day. So there's Sheikh Saleh Zain al-Abidin al-Shaybi, who is currently, I think, the 106th custodian of the Holy Kaaba. So he's the one who holds the key, opens it and closes it, presides over the washing of the Kaaba and those ceremonies. He's called As-Sadin al-Awwal. They still keep the ancient expression Sidana, Sadin. He's the first custodian. There's others, if he's sick or travelling, somebody else will do it, but he's As-Sadin al-Awwal. And all of the names are known right back to the time of the Fath Mecca. Qusay dies, having done this, and the four sons then divide up the city, sell some of the lands. Abdal is finally pushed out, can't retain his privileges. Manaf and his sons take these over, and he has two sons who are really well-known and successful, Hashim and Muttalib. So you basically have now an incipient civil war situation with the followers of Abdal saying, he's the oldest son, of course he should be chief honcho in the city, but then Abd Manaf, with his two sons, have appropriated these rights, and it looks as if there's going to be some kind of civil dispute, which is nothing new in the city. So this is the beginning of something called the Pact of the Perfumed, Hilf al-Fudul. Followers of Abd Manaf and his sons Hashim and Muttalib go to the Kaaba, and some women bring a bowl which is full of perfume to the brim. And they all put their hands in the bowl of perfume and touch the Kaaba and make an oath that they will stick together and not betray each other. And then Abdal's sons take a similar oath, and things are looking grim. War almost breaks out, but then a kind of compromise is reached. Essentially what seems to have been is that Abdal's followers and his sons got some of the kind of status offices. In other words, they got to hold the war banners and the key to the Kaaba, and the others would get things to do specifically with the Hajj pilgrimage and the Umrah, which were lucrative. So they got the kind of tax rights. So they were going for the money and the others were going for the status. Now, we need to revert again to the sense of what the Arabian cult was like at this time, and this very strange status that Mecca has as the seat of the purest, most uncompromising, transcendentalist form of Abrahamic monotheism, on the one hand, and at the same time this really exuberant, flourishing, strong paganism. The last holdout of paganism in the ancient world. Everybody else around Arabia has joined a monotheism. Ethiopia has been Christian for a long time, so has Egypt, Syria, and then he went over to Iran, where people were Zoroastrians or Mazdaeans, a lot of Christians there as well. Yemen was ruled by a Jewish king, Dhul Nawas. The Arabs are surrounded by followers of the higher religions, people who 3 centuries earlier had been worshipping Venus and Mars, and now they're Christians, and now the Arabs are the last pagan holdout, the really last pagan holdout, and Mecca is their sacred city, even though it's founded by Sayyidina Ibrahim Khalilullah. There's a kind of irony and richness to that narrative. Now, the pagan religion of the Arabs was therefore in a state of constant tension, not just with the monotheisms, which carried with them the prestige of urban civilization nearby. So the Arabs would go to a place like Palmyra or Jerusalem or places in Ethiopia and be dazzled by huge temples and statues and cave cities, and it was astounding. Nothing like that in pagan Arabia. So the religions associated with that great sort of late antique world carried with them a lot of prestige. It was a kind of prestigious thing to be a Christian or a Jew. And it seems many of the Jews of Arabia were actually Arabs who had converted to Judaism. Many of the Jews of Medina, for instance, the Jewish tribes there, Qurayza and Qaynuqa and so forth, Bani Nadir, the 3 Jewish tribes of Medina, may very well have been local Arab tribes who had converted to Judaism. We tend to forget that until they were squashed by church Christianity, the Jews were a very successful missionary religion in the ancient world. And certainly in Arabia this was the case. Big Jewish communities in the Yemen until only 30 or 40 years ago. Synagogues in Bahrain and so forth. It's a major world religion. Maybe 10% of the population of the late Roman Empire was Jewish. And of course Christianity, with the enormous status of the Roman Empire itself, the Byzantine emperor in the dazzling palace in Constantinople, which we're told occasionally the Arabs would visit. They kind of had a complex. It was a bit like being, say, from New Guinea, and then you arrive at Heathrow Airport, and it's all just too much, kind of culture shock. It was like they were from the New Stone Age, and they were seeing the sophisticated world of late antique Hellenism, one of the world's great civilizations. So they had this complex. But at the same time, as well as some of them becoming Christians, and we know that the Holy Prophet's own uncle, Waraqa bin Nawfal, Tanassara fil Jahiliyyah, had become a Christian in the Jahiliyyah. Even in Mecca, there's Christians. That there's this other thing called the Hanafiyya, which is quite difficult to pin down, but seems to have been quite widespread. According to the Muslim historians, these are, as it were, freelance monotheists. These are people who really are not at ease with the exuberant paganism and the statues with popping eyes and the magic arrows and things, and the soothsayers and the witches and the wizards and the sprites and the elves and the goblins. They don't really go for that. And they find monotheism much more impressive, coherent, ethical. They like the idea of heaven as well as a very shadowy, almost non-existent afterlife, which was promised to the pagan Arabs. They're attracted to it, but they don't become Jews and they don't become Christians, and they attach themselves in what must have been a rather loose and vague way to the Arab ancestral memory of Ibrahim alayhi salam and Hajar and Ismail alayhi salam. So these are Abrahamic monotheists who aren't really practicing anything that's revealed, except that they know that they are dissidents. They don't like this pagan thing. They find the spectacle of the 360 idols around the Kaaba just preposterous and disgraceful. And we have a certain amount of material, and Yuri Rubin's written a very good article, Hanafiyya and Kaaba. He accepts the reality of these people. Rubin is quite optimistic about the viability of the Muslim memory. His reason for believing in the existence of these Hanafiyya is that actually the Muslim sources often present them as opposing the Holy Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Some convert to Islam, some oppose him. And Rubin says very unlikely that Muslim sources, if they just invented these guys, would have had them opposing him. So his view as a secular historian is that there were these Abrahamic monotheists. So we have poems from a few of them. Umayyah ibn Abi Salt, كل دين يوم القيامة عند الله إلا دين الحنيفة بور. On the Day of Judgment, we believe in that, which the Arabs didn't, in the sight of God, will come to nothing except the religion of the Hanifs, the Hanafiyya. So this is, as it were, getting into its second wind as the result of the Arabs' kind of complex about being these kind of fetish worshippers surrounded by great civilizations. And then Abd Manaf, his best known son is Hashim. And Hashim becomes the great grandfather of the Holy Prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam. So the Hashemites are still a force in the land in several parts of the Muslim world. It's the most distinguished branch of Quraysh. Hashim was given by his father the rights of rifada and siqaya, feeding and watering the pilgrims, which was a lucrative office, and was also a wealthy trader. And this is how we mostly remember Hashim, solidly embedded in the religion of his people, but he is constantly traveling, according to all the Muslim sources. And where the Quran, Sira 106, I think it is, talks about إِلَى فِي قُرَيْشٍ لِإِلَى فِي قُرَيْشٍ إِلَى فِيهِمْ رِحْلَةَ الشِّتَاءِ وَالصَّيْفِ, which is grammatically a rather mysterious kind of surah, beginning with a preposition. What is it li for? Grammarians argue about it. But the Muslim historians believe that this is the Rihlat al-Shita'i wal-Sayf. The journey of the summer and the winter was the journeys to Syria and Yemen, respectively, accomplished every year by great caravans of traders coming out from the city of Mecca, and it was Hashim who established that. All the Muslim historians say this. Now, the name Hashim also is said to mean the one who breaks bread or makes a kind of broth, because he's also remembered for having saved the people of Mecca from a famine by going on his trade route up to Syria and buying a lot of bread and distributing it in Mecca. Must have been a bit hard by the time it arrived, I should think, but historians say. Probably something more like ship's biscuit, something you just needed to add water to and it would be just about palatable. So he's Hashim, the breaker of bread, the maker of tharid, or broth, so a traditional patron of the city, as well as its effective ruler. Now, Arabia by this time, to the north, the Byzantine Empire, which is by law Christian, paganism has been legally prohibited and exterminated. If you watch that film, Agora, about the last pagans of Alexandria and the burning of the library there, you'll see how violent a process that was. Ramsay MacMullen, his book Christianizing the Roman Empire, shows with what extreme brutality the Roman Empire was Christianized. But by this time, the temples are closed, the philosophy academies are closed. It's emphatically Christian, even though divided into many different denominations. And to the north of Arabia, there's a kind of buffer state. Nobody really wants to conquer Arabia because there's nothing there. The Romans never really make the attempt. The Persians can't be bothered. The Arabs are really difficult. They run away into the hills and you don't know where to find them. It's enormous. Don't bother. So that's one reason why paganism has managed to remain intact, because it's these desert fastnesses and this enormous hot space. But on the frontiers, you have two buffer states ruled by Arab kings. You have the Bani Ghassan, known to Western historians as the Ghassanids. For some reason, Orientalists like to use this id ending, which is rather strange. They don't do it for, say, English dynasties. You don't get the Tudorids, for instance, when you're studying. It sounds a bit like aphid or kind of insect. I don't know where it comes from. Anyway, somebody can correct me. But you've got the Ghassanids, who are Christian, and they are under the authority, the suzerainty of the Byzantine emperors. And their job is to just be a buffer state to stop the wild Arabs sort of sacking Damascus or obstructing the road to Jerusalem. And further to the east, the Sassanid Empire, the Persians, have also established an also Christian buffer state, the Lakhmids, with their capital in a town called Hira, which I think is nowadays in Iraq, which was, again, a great Christian city with basilicas and a bishop and so on. It's not really been properly excavated, I think. So between the Arabs and the north, as they're going up on these caravans, there are these places. And if you go to the town of Bosra, which I've been to, Bosra in Syria, you'll see that really is the end of the official Roman Empire and the beginning of the wild lands to the south. And it's a Roman city. There's a big amphitheatre, and there's basilicas and great city walls. It's quite impressive. That was the end of the Roman Empire. It was like Hadrian's Wall. Beyond Hadrian's Wall, there's only Scotland. You know, the Romans didn't want to deal with the Scotch tribes, where they eat deep-fried Mars bars and very good at fighting. Hadrian's Wall was one end of the empire. At the opposite end, you have Bosra and the end of Arabia, and the beginning of what they call Palestina Tertia, the Third Palestine, which is a vaguely delineated area to the south of settled Palestine, which would include parts of Sinai and the Hijaz, essentially. From a certain Roman perspective, Mecca is actually in Palestine, but in this very undelineated sort of southern area. Nobody in his right mind would ever want to go there. So Hashim is associated with all of this. Now, the Western historians, following somebody called Henri Lamens, who was a Belgian historian about 100 years ago, have liked to see Mecca in this time as really thriving commercially. Hashim, the great trader, these big caravans to Yemen, to Syria, all kinds of things, ivory and ebony and slaves and frankincense and gold are being traded. And a lot of Western Orientalists have bought into that image. More recently, however, we've started to think that that can't have been the case. So, for instance, an obvious argument against it is, why is Mecca then not like Palmyra or Hatra or Qaryat al-Faw or Petra? In other words, great temples and things that you can excavate, and rock tombs and Roman roads. And there's not a sign of anything like that. As we've said, everything is made of mud until the time of the Sira. Not much money sloshing around in Mecca if it's the centre of this big kind of capitalistic web. There's no real evidence that a seaport was regularly used to transport goods of any value from the city of Mecca. Although really it would have been a lot easier to ship goods by sea if you were taking them from Yemen to Syria than to send them 60 days across the trackless wastes of the Arabian desert full of bandits and snakes and everything else that's out there. Go by sea, but there's no real evidence for that either. So the most that we can say is that there was some local trade that Hashim and his friends were engaged in, which probably was the kind of low-value goods that you get in a desert hinterland. So there's references to leather goods, to dried cheese, raisins, things like that. But this kind of Arabian Nights image of ivory and slaves and gold and so forth just doesn't seem to have been the case. And this is important because a major, almost orthodox Orientalist theory for the rise of Islam in the second half of the 20th century was that because Mecca was so super rich, that people were creating their social networks on the basis of economic interest rather than tribe. And because the religion was connected to tribal affiliation, that led to what Montgomery Watt, who was the author of this theory really, professor of Arabic at Edinburgh in the 50s and 60s and 70s, called a kind of capitalistic crisis and a spiritual vacuum. That was really what you'd be taught in any British university until 20 or 30 years ago. Why did Islam happen? Because of a spiritual crisis in 7th century Arabia. Why was there a spiritual crisis? Because the elite in Mecca was no longer really committed to the pagan deities, because now most of their friends and their wheeling and dealing business associates were from far away or from other tribes, and therefore what was the point of these fetishes and idols which defined your identity and your social network? So on that theory, into that void, into that spiritual vacuum, steps the Holy Prophet and steps the Quran. That's the explanation. Now, however, because of more recent work in a wide range of historical writings and annals and languages, it seems that really there isn't much evidence at all that Mecca was this kind of gigantic emporium or shopping centre. Not like that at all. It was dirt poor, not the centre of a major network at all, which means that the mystery of the rise of Islam is still a headache for a lot of modern scholarship. So Hashim, allegedly, this great trader, dies. He dies in Gaza, you can see his tomb there. And then we have another event that seems to militate against the idea that there's these caravans going around all the time, which is that the Persians, shock horror, capture the Middle East from the Byzantines, and they destroy Jerusalem, and they plunder everything. And this is referred to Ghulibat al-Rum, Surah 30 of the Quran. The Byzantines are overthrown, and then the Quranic prophecy, the prediction that the Byzantines will prevail again. So Hashim dies, and the other son of Abd Manaf, Abdul Muttalib, takes over the key offices, including the Rifada and the Siqaya, and he's another really generous, traditional, kind of open-handed, liberal Arab chieftain. His nickname is Al-Fayyid, because he always gives and he gives. This is a virtue of the Arabs. He's not really called Abdul Muttalib, which is a funny kind of name. His actual name is Shayba, so his descendants, the Bani Shayba, still control the Kaaba to this day. And it is to Abdul Muttalib that all the sources attribute the rediscovery of the well of Zamzam. Remember, Jurhum, before clearing off, the last thing they do in a hurry is to destroy the well and to destroy its treasure. So here's Ibn Ishaq's account. It's a miraculous kind of, at this point we start to get miraculous foreshadowings, or as it were, the kind of little tremors that happen before a big earthquake. It's starting to rock the ground because the chosen one is only a few decades away. While Abdul Muttalib was sleeping in the Hajar, He saw in a dream that he was commanded to excavate the well of Zamzam. He said, I was sleeping in the Hajar, and I heard a voice saying, dig tiba, sweetness. And I said, what's tiba? Then he left me. I slept again the next day, and he came back and said, dig barra, the good. I asked and said, what is that? And he left me. The third day he came again and said, dig al-madnuna, the one that is concealed. I asked what that was, and again he went away. The next day when he came, he said, dig Zamzam. I asked, what is Zamzam? And he said, I'll do it in English, never shall it fail and never run dry. The pilgrim throng, it shall water all. It lies twixt the dung and the bleeding flesh, by the nest where white-winged ravens fly, by the nest where ants all creeping ply. Abdul-Muttalib looks around and finds a place near the Kaaba that suits this description, a place where there's sacrificial blood on the ground between the statues, the idols of Asif and Naila, and he goes and gets his son Al-Harith with a pickaxe, and they dig. They unearth the two famous golden gazelles, which have been buried by the last king of Jurham. They find a lot of swords and armour, and then the well is there. And immediately there's an argument. Who owns this well? It's not really in anybody's back garden. It's next to the Kaaba. It's immensely precious. And so in order to resolve this, according to the historians, Abdul-Muttalib says, if I ever have 10 sons, I swear that I will sacrifice one of them by the Kaaba. And in the event, he does have 10 sons. And he calls them together and says, now it's time to determine who is going to have this kind of Abrahamic experience. Each one writes his name on an arrow, and he takes them to the great idol, Hubal. And Abdallah's, the youngest son, the beloved son, his name comes out. And so Abdul-Muttalib takes him to this place, sacrificial place, and prepares to sacrifice him. But first of all, he goes to a kind of seer, a female diviner, to say, is this exactly what I should be doing? And she said, because the blood price of one male is 10 camels, draw lots between 10 camels and Abdallah and see what comes up. He draws lots, it's still Abdallah. He adds another 10 camels, it's still Abdallah. When he gets to 100, it's the camels. So he slaughters the camels, and Quraysh satisfied, and Abdallah, who's of course the father of the Holy Prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam, is saved. The last thing we need to be aware of, because we're going to finish very shortly, is the year of the elephant, which is the year of the prophetic birth. Yemen has been through another set of turbulences, having been in Persian hands, Ethiopian hands, Jewish hands through Dhul Nawas. Surah Al-Buruj refers to the destruction of Christianity at the hands of Dhul Nawas. Dhul Nawas is deposed by the Ethiopians, who sent a kind of army of convicts, and Abraha, who is the Ethiopian kind of ruler, suzerain over Yemen, becomes the re-establisher of Christianity, and he builds this amazing church. He writes to the Ethiopian king, I have built a church for you, O king, such as has not been built for any king before you. I shall not rest until I have diverted the whole pilgrimages of the Arabs to it. Now, one Arab from Mecca, a pagan, is outraged by this. And so he goes and he commits an obscene act in the church. And Abraha realizes that he has to use force and sends his famous army north to Mecca, led by an elephant. Originally, once there were elephants in Arabia and lions, and you can see it in ancient inscriptions, giraffes were common in Arabia. By this time, an elephant has to come from Africa on a ship, and it's not a common sight. It's quite terrifying. On his way, he plunders 200 camels which belong to Abdul-Muttalib, and is just before the city, and the people of Mecca say, we can't cope with this big Ethiopian army, but he wants to destroy the Kaaba. What shall we do? Abdul-Muttalib, who is recognized as the senior spokesman of the city, goes out and manages to have an audience with Abraha. And Abraha says, what do you want? And he says, I want my 200 camels back. And Abraha says, if you were really in love with this house, Baytullah, You would ask me to spare the house. You wouldn't ask for your 200 camels back. But he says, the house has its Lord who will protect it. But I'm the Lord of these 200 camels and I want them back. So Abraha thinks these Arabs are really something else, marches on the city, and the custodians of the elephant get the elephant to lead the army. But according to the traditional sources, the elephant will go in any direction except the direction of the Kaaba. And so they beat the elephant, it won't move. They get iron hooks and they scratch the elephant, but it won't move. And then, of course, and again, this is in Muslim histories, the flock of birds, Tayran Ababil, another of the earliest surahs, that the Ashab al-Fil are defeated by this Tayran Ababil and Tarmihim bihijaratin min sijil, raining upon them stones of clay, فَجَعَلَهُمْ كَعَصْفٍ مَأْكُولٍ, and made them as a harvested field, stubble. And according to Tabari, at any rate, they turn tail when they see these birds the size of starlings, each with a stone in its beak and a stone in each claw, raining them from a great height with these pebbles, probably the size of marbles. But also Tabari mentioned, and it is said, that this is the first year in which smallpox was seen in Arabia. And certainly the sources indicate that by the time Abraha gets back to the mountains of the Yemen, he's really sick, like a plucked chicken, he was described. He's really falling apart and he dies shortly afterwards. In any case, we have reached the year of the birth of the Blessed Prophet, born in the year of the elephant, and we've reached the end, I believe, of our appointed time. So I think you'll agree this is quite a captivating story. And I've told just 1% of it. There's a lot more. But it's important to get this background to the emergence of the Holy Prophet in order to realize the immensity of his achievement. Taking people who are in the heart of polytheism and bringing them to a belief in the One. Taking them from a belief that there was no higher morality to a belief in higher morality. Taking them from no belief really in life after death into a mindset where life after death dominated everything they did. Taking them from tribal disunity with no laws into a world in which the Sharia was the law to which every tribe was subject. An immense series of achievements. And when we understand the Jahili period and this prehistory of Islam, then we start to view the rest of the story of the Sira with renewed and redoubled respect, inshaAllah. Barakallahu fikum wal afu minkum. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.